Sorry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't want to detain the House either, but can I, and I hope he doesn't turn to dust, but can I agree with the member for Perth and North Perthshire, not on the content, but this seems to be the tone that he started with this particular debate. And there is one thing that I think is worth putting on the record. We spend an inordinate of times with our Whip's office through the usual channels, government, opposition and SNP whips, and I understand that there was a broad agreement that this would be the way that today would operate, and therefore that's why we are here. And we would very much like some more time in this chamber, but unfortunately that's not what's going to happen at report stage in third reading. But given that the government has accepted most of our amendments on the permanency of the Scottish Parliament, on the fact that the Scottish Parliament can now design its own social security system, and the government has moved towards the removal of the perceived vetoes and indeed in the equalities section, then we think the vow has been delivered, and therefore we agree that some of the government amendments, and the government has come forward with their amendments that agree with some of ours. So I think we should get on with the debate this afternoon, discuss some of these issues, and perhaps if the SNP push this to a vote, we'll see whether or not the House agrees.
Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is a great pleasure to move our new clauses to this part of the bill, new clauses 2, 3, 5, amendments 21, 22, 33 and the other new clauses and amendments in my name and those of my honourable friends. We have a lot of ground to cover still in this short debate, but it is important to state at the outset the crucial welfare clauses in this bill, and the fact that the crucial welfare clauses in this bill deliver on the vow and the Smith agreement in both spirit and substance. That was not the case before the government tabled its latest tranche of amendments last Monday, and that is why, and my SNP colleagues were right to highlight earlier, that the Deputy Leader of the Scottish Labour Party did say the vow hadn't been met, and indeed the architect of the vow, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, made exactly the same points. But given that the Minister has laid those amendments this Monday, we now believe that the benefits issue has been resolved and therefore the vow has been delivered. And this is a crucial victory for the Scottish Parliament, the importance of which cannot be overstated. And I did say at the end of the committee stage of the debate that if the government did nothing else, they should concede to my Amendment 31 at that time. That would allow the Scottish Parliament the power to effectively design its own social security system, and their new Clause 34 does that, and we will support them on it. I'm happy to give way.
The member for Edinburgh South can tell me if he thinks that the proposals as laid down tonight are as close to federalism as you can get. Yes or no will do the trick for me.
I'm delighted that the honourable gentleman actually intervened with that, because it allows me to put the record straight. Because what the SNP don't say is the second sentence of what the Right Honourable Gordon Brown said. And the second sentence was, as close to federalism as we can get in the context of 85% of it being one block called England. That is what he says, and that's something they never ever talk about when they talk about as near to federalism as possible. And I think the Right Honourable Gordon Brown can speak for himself when he says these things, and that is exactly the context he put this particular bill in. Now, the member for Banff and Buchan actually agreed with the amendments that have come forward on welfare from the Secretary of State. We agree as well, and I would have thought there would have been some kind of consensus across the chamber for these particular amendments. Let me turn to new clause 2 and the government new clause 34. Part 3 of this bill, as we know, devolves to the Scottish Parliament new and substantial powers over welfare, transferring to it £2.5 billion worth of welfare responsibility. And as I said when we debated this part in committee, this presents a real opportunity for Scotland and the Scottish Parliament. Today we will pass amendments that will fundamentally transform the Scottish Parliament's relationship with the social security system. And that is why the bill is so important. According to the House of Commons Library, if the bill were passed in its present form, the Scottish Parliament would be responsible for 62% of all public expenditure. But our new Clause 2 and the Government's new Clause 34 will give the Scottish Parliament total freedom to create new benefits in all devolved areas. That's total freedom to create new benefits in all devolved areas. It would then be up to the Scottish Government of the day to design the system that they want and that the Scottish people have voted for, and find the resources to pay for that system. The same goes for Government's new Clause 14, which devolves the Scottish Parliament's legislative competence regarding welfare foods. I believe that was an SNP amendment, and again we support that. The power to create new benefits in devolved areas were the Smith Agreement's recommendation, and delivering on this commitment has been an absolute priority for this side of the House. We tabled the initial new clause at committee stage, which the Government voted against, but I am delighted that the Secretary of State and the Government have now come over to our way of thinking, as he has done on the veto and also on the carers' allowance. As the SNP finally conceded halfway through a Scottish Labour debate in the Scottish Parliament last week, and as we have heard again tonight, the original Clause 21 and this new clause affords the Scottish Parliament the power to also top up any reserve benefit. There can now be no doubt that the Scotland Bill will allow the Scottish Government to fully compensate the Scottish families affected by the Government's pernicious cuts to tax credits. I am happy to give way again.
Thank you for giving way. The reality is that Scotland will pay for the administration of tax credits. They will also pay for the administration to top up tax credits. In order to do that, rather than just devolve it, why should we pay for its administration twice under what he is proposing?
Well, actually, it allows for the top-up of any reserve benefit and for the introduction of any devolved benefit. So although we use the terminology restoration, you would have to actually create a new top-up reserve benefit. And as the Scotland Bill does, and where a lot of misunderstanding comes in the Scotland Bill, is these benefits aren't being devolved, they're effectively being switched off. And therefore the Scottish Government would have to come forward with proposals in any of the provisions that are currently in the bill. We're running out of time, Mr Speaker, so do let me press on. We will not cut tax credits for Scottish working families. Kezia Dugdale, the Scottish Labour Party leader, has made that quite clear, and we've been very, very clear how we would pay for it. It's interesting tonight that on 4 different occasions we haven't heard from the SNP if they will match that commitment. I hear from a secondary position people saying twice, but if they look at the record, they'll show that it's a very clearly costed policy, using the new powers in the Scotland Bill to be able to deliver that policy. Let me move on, because we're running out of time, to move some of my other amendments, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we've already had complaints we've got a restricted debate, and therefore you would have thought, given we agree on the welfare provisions, that the braying mob behind me would just take a little bit of time to run through some of those in order for us to be able to get through what we want. So now that the Secretary of State has come to Labour's way of thinking on the power to create new benefits, I think the bill strikes the right balance between reserved and devolved areas, and that's what the Smith Agreement said. The welfare state and the social security system should remain shared across these islands. Let me quickly turn to new clause 3, which would establish a joint committee on welfare devolution to oversee the transition and implementation of the welfare powers transferred by this bill, and I think that goes some way to resolving the intervention by the honourable gentleman from Aberdeen South. This clause, the details of which are set out in new Schedule 1, provides for a cross-parliament committee to oversee the transition and implementation of welfare powers. The SCVO have therefore welcomed their new clause as, and I quote, a pragmatic proposal given the need to ensure continuous, timely delivery of social security payments to those who receive them. It is, of course, goes without saying that I want any new committee established to be completely open and transparent, and we've already seen from the Scottish Government claiming they may reject the Scotland Bill if the secretive fiscal framework is not to their liking. We can't afford for that to happen with regard to these important welfare provisions. Let me just move new clause 5. I said throughout the process that while Labour's key aim is to ensure that we deliver in full on the recommendations of the Smith Agreement, we are prepared to go beyond it where we see a reasonable argument for applies to our new clause 5, which goes beyond the Smith Agreement in seeking to devolve the childcare element of universal credit to the Scottish Parliament. Amendments 21, 22 and 23, another area in which I believe we should go beyond what the Smith Agreement recommended, is on the subject of making payments to individuals who have been sanctioned. The Honourable Lady for Banff-and-Buchan mentioned this in her eloquent speech as well. The Labour Party is committed to reviewing the UK sanctions regime, the punitive nature of which is beginning to spiral out of control, forcing people into destitution on the back of draconian DWP targets. This is why we believe the Scottish Parliament should have the power to make payments to individuals who have had payments unfairly reduced, suspended or withdrawn due to the UK's government's sanctions regime. I'd also like to move on to Labour Amendments 24 and 25, which I will address alongside Government Amendments 77 and 78, Mr Deputy Speaker. These all concern the perceived existence on the face of the bill of a UK ministerial veto in relation to the regulations making powers for universal credit being transferred to the Scottish Parliament. I'm grateful that the Secretary of State has again listened not just to the Labour Party but also to the SNP on this particular issue, has redrafted those clauses and has removed the perceived veto. When I wrote to the Secretary of State to confirm this, he did write back and say quite clearly and gave me the assurance that the UK Government would have, and I quote, a legal obligation to implement any changes made by Scottish ministers. Mr Speaker, Deputy Speaker, let me also move Amendments 70 and 70. Welcome Amendments 70 and 71 in the name of the Secretary of State, which remove the current restrictive definitions of carers allowance. I'm very disappointed he hasn't removed the same restrictions on disability allowance that was asked for by many of the disability charities in Scotland. Amendment 194 offers an alternative, broader and more flexible definition of disability benefit, and I hope that if the Secretary of State can't give us a satisfactory answer, we will pursue this in the other place at the next stage. Let me just turn briefly, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the issue of abortion. And let me make it quite clear from this dispatch box. No one in this chamber is saying that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the capacity or indeed the responsibility to deal with abortion. What it said in the Smith Agreement was there would be a process. We've heard very eloquently this evening from my right honourable friend from Pontefract and Castleford that the issue with regards to the devolution of abortion has to be done both properly and sensitively. The Secretary of State avoided my intervention earlier. He said in this House back in July that the Smith Agreement did not allow for the devolution of abortion at this stage, and it would not be in this bill, but a proper process would be put in place to ensure that it is done both sensitively, properly and in consultation with women's organisations in Scotland. I do not think the Secretary of State, frantically calling round women's organisations in Scotland on the day that he puts forward the amendment as satisfactory consultation, or takes into account the issues that many women in Scotland have contacted me about. And let me just make this point as well. This isn't about the time level for abortion, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is around the entire complex matrix of the legislation that sits behind it, the criminality of abortion, the issues of authorisation of abortion, where abortions can be carried out. It is not just about 24 weeks, it is much, much more than that, and the Secretary of State should reflect on the fact that a proper consultation needs to be put in place. Otherwise, he is in danger of doing something incredibly dangerous to abortion in this country. I'm happy to give way briefly.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. The Secretary of State said time and time again, when taking interventions, that his view was that the Scottish Parliament had the capacity to legislate on this. Would my honourable friend agree with me? It's not a question of whether or not the capacity is there. It's a question of whether or not it is desirable to have two different legislative regimes for this in Scotland and England.
Well, regardless of who legislates for it, you may end up with two different legislative regimes on the other side of the border. And I'm perfectly confident in the Scottish Parliament, and I take the First Minister's word that she won't change the regulations, but that's not to say that the regulations down here might not change, and you end up with abortion tourism. Nobody wants that across the United Kingdom, and my honourable friend, my right honourable friend who took the Scotland Act through this place, he didn't take it through this place, but was heavily involved in it, knows the issues around abortion and why they didn't go with regards to that. I will just quickly move on, because I want to move Amendment 26. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, this Amendment 26 makes explicit that among the exceptions to reserved matters under equal opportunities, the power is being devolved to the Scottish Parliament to set gender quotas. This is an issue that the Labour Party takes very seriously, and we thank the Women's 50/50 campaign for helping us with these particular issues. I just want to briefly move Amendment 225 and conclude with this, Mr Deputy Speaker. We now have a welfare section of this bill that, in line with the Smith Agreement, everyone in this chamber should be incredibly proud of that achievement, and now we must move on to the debate about how we use these powers.
Mr Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. May I add my thanks to those of the Secretary of State for everyone involved in this bill, his officials and the people who have been so supportive to us on this side of the House, my PPS, the Honourable Lady from Stoke-on-Trent, and of course the Honourable Member for Caerphilly, who's taken many of this parts of the bill through the House. But also, Mr Speaker, the people of this House, the Public Bill Office and the clerks who have been incredibly helpful in putting together this bill. It has been like wading through treacle at times, but they have always been courteous and their advice has always been well received. Mr Speaker, at the outset, let me be absolutely clear about where the Labour Party stands in relation to this bill. We fully support the Scotland Bill and all it seeks to achieve. You would think they would just stop for 2 minutes, Mr Speaker, in third reading, but it seems to be now, when the Secretary of State, the Conservative Secretary of State spoke, it was in complete silence. When the Labour Party speaks, the brain mob starts. That tells you all you need to know about this place, Mr Speaker. With the amendments that have been accepted this evening, we can say that the vow has been delivered in full, and it delivers on the powers that were promised and agreed by all parties, including the Scottish National Party and the Smith Commission. In 1998, Donald Dewar said, and I quote, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament." And it was Labour, with the consent of the Scottish people, that delivered that Parliament. This bill will make the Scottish Parliament one of the most powerful devolved legislators in the world. This bill not only meets the terms of the vow, it also meets the timetable laid out by Gordon Brown last year. We promised a process by the end of October. It was delivered. We promised it would conclude by St Andrew's Day. It was delivered. Draft legislation was promised by January. It was delivered. And second reading of the Scotland Bill was promised straight after the general election, regardless who won, and that was delivered. And we promised that no matter what parties formed the government after the election, we would deliver a bill to meet what the Smith Commission set out. And thank you to the Secretary of State's amendments put forward on Monday. It has been delivered. But it's absolutely clear that this bill, as amended, will place at the Scottish Government's disposal the powers to make Scotland the fairer and more equal country that we all aspire for. I'm not going to take interventions because I want the opposition from the SNP to speak, and if I take interventions, he'll be talked out. So if you wouldn't mind, your leader will make those contributions. Mr Speaker, from the establishment of the Scottish Parliament to the Calman Commission to the Scotland Act of 2012, Labour has supported more powers for the Scottish Parliament. But we are absolutely clear about what we stand for. We believe in devolution, not separation. And that is what the people of Scotland voted for last year, and we respect the sovereign will of the Scottish people. They said they wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom, but with a strong Scottish Parliament. They said they wanted to continue the pooling and sharing of resources across these islands. And they said that they wanted the continued security that being part of the bigger union of nations and family of nations brought. Tonight, Mr Speaker, this bill provides a historic opportunity for our politics in Scotland to turn from talking about the Constitution to talking about the country. What we can do to make Scotland the fairest nation on earth instead of what we can't. Let's grab that opportunity. Let's build that fairer nation. Let's give the people across Scotland the politics that they deserve. And in the words of Donald Dewar, there shall be a powerful Scottish Parliament.